All right, I guess we can start. Dear listeners, thank you for joining us for the fourth episode of our podcast, Vapers Voice. My name is Liza. I'm community manager of the World Vapers Alliance. And for those of you who haven't heard about us before, the World Vapers Alliance amplifies the voice of passionate vapers around the world and empowers them to make a difference for their communities. Our alliance includes our partner associations that represent vapers and more than 30,000 individual vapers from around the world. You can find more information about our alliance, or even better, join us by following our website, worldvapersalliance.com. I'm moving on to topic of discussion now. Our listeners probably already know that the biggest enemy of vaping is misinformation that constantly leads people into believing in misconceptions and myths about vaping. And past year has seen the publication of many studies that tried to undermine the harm reduction benefits of vaping. While it might be clear for scientists and public health experts that are actively involved in tobacco harm reduction fields that most of those allegations do not correspond with reality, it might be sometimes hard for consumers to filter out the most accurate information. That leads us to a bigger problem. Misconceptions lead policymakers into implementing more restrictive policies on vaping and prevent smokers from switching to vaping. As a reminder, vaping has been acknowledged by Public Health England to be 95% less harmful than smoking. So, what is the truth about vaping and what does science have to say? To debunk the most common myths about vaping today, we will be talking with the world leading scientist, professor of pharmacology at the University of Graz, and scientific advisor of the World Vapers Alliance, Professor Bernd. Professor Meyer, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Lisa, for your kind introduction. But I'm certainly not the world leading scientist. But it's nice that you said so. Yeah.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you as a guest
Yeah.
speaker. Let me start with just an introductory question. As we mentioned, vaping is under threat, and the main reason for that is misinformation. And all of that not only prevents smokers from quitting, but also largely affects the legislation globally. A fatal mistake that policymakers keep on making is to treat vaping the same as smoking. Professor Meyer, I found it also extremely interesting to read your publication on the most common arguments that are made usually against vaping. And you discuss in this publication the misconceptions and how to respond to them. I'd like to start with more of a general question, introductory type of question, and ask you, what do you think are the most common misconceptions about vaping?
Oh, there are countless misconceptions. I think I could talk for hours about them. But let me keep it brief. I think one of the fundamental misconceptions is very trivial, but has far reaching consequences. And this results from the apparent similarities of vaping and smoking. So the vast majority of users are former or current smokers. So it's the same type of people who use either cigarettes, e-cigarettes, or tobacco cigarettes. And it's also the name. The devices are called cigarettes. That there's a huge difference between electronic cigarettes and tobacco cigarettes is comes next, but many people don't realize that. And then the users exhibit the same behavior. Both exhale visible clouds. The vapor clouds often are even more intense than cigarette smoke. And based on all these similarities, it's easy to mislead people into thinking that vaping and smoking are the same thing. So this is one misconception, is the similarity. But another one, often not recognized, is related to a gut feeling or emotion of the public that all synthetic chemicals are bad and toxic. So chemistry is bad, but nature is good. Natural products are green and healthy. And anti vaping activists often take advantage of this irrational perception and deliver the message that e liquids are cocktails of toxic chemicals. I often heard that. It's just toxic cocktails that people inhale. While tobacco, they don't say it, but it's implicitly they deliver the message that tobacco is a plant based natural product and thereby more healthy. You know? Of course, this is rubbish. Even our bodies are cocktails of chemicals. I always tell this to opponents. Yeah? And the most potent toxins are not synthesized by evil chemists. in white coats, but they're made by nature. Well, and the final misconception, I think we will talk about this later. I hope, at least I hope so, is the misconception that nicotine is the major harmful component of tobacco smoke. Many people are convinced that this is the case. According to public belief, vapers are exposed to the same deadly and highly addictive neurotoxin as smokers, but additionally exposed to the variety of synthetic chemicals which I just mentioned that are not present in tobacco smoke, that are additional chemicals like flavors and other things. So this leads to the seemingly logical conclusion that vaping is at least as harmful as smoking, presumably even more harmful. A conclusion that is, of course, fundamentally wrong. And I don't think I have to explain this in this audience here that the problem of smoking is the combustion of tobacco and not the nicotine.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I think the way we can approach this interview would be to talk more in detail about some of the misconceptions that you have already mentioned. And I'd like to start exactly by asking about nicotine and its toxicity. So Yorkshire Cancer Research stated that one of the three main causes of death from smoking, which are lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and cardiovascular disease, none are caused by nicotine. The harm from smoking comes from thousands of other chemicals in tobacco smoke, yet nicotine is being demonized. And not many people understand that. In other words, people consume nicotine, but they die from smoking. Professor Meyer, let's demystify nicotine and its consumption. What does science say? What are the real clinical effects of nicotine consumption? Or, in other words, how toxic is nicotine in reality?
Yeah, this, of course, has been one of my major topics during the past decade, and I'm pretty familiar with this topic, of course. But let me maybe first start with the good news. Nicotine, and this is often kept under the rug, yeah? Nicotine has well documented positive effects on mood and cognition. This is well established. It's even discussed to use nicotine or nicotine analogs, yeah, for treatment of certain cognitive deficits. So it's very clear that it has positive effects on cognition and mood. And these pleasant effects explain the widespread use of nicotine as a recreational drug. So users simply enjoy the effects of nicotine. They like it. And that's what opponents often overlook. Of course, there are potentially, at least potentially harmful effects. Most of them are related, virtually all of them are related to the cardiovascular system because nicotine activates sympathetic reactions or causes sympathetic reactions. It causes slight and transient increases in heart rate and blood pressure. That's well established. There are many publications on this. When you inhale nicotine, you get a slight increase in your pulse, and you get a slight increase in your systolic and diastolic blood pressure. These effects are mild and transient, and the question is whether they are a reason for concern. Well, I don't think so. There are several large epidemiological studies out there that are published that showed that long-term nicotine use is not associated with an increased risk for serious cardiovascular events such as myocardial infarction or stroke. So at least for the normal population, if you are healthy, I think that nicotine consumption, even on a long term, even over decades, should not be of any harm. A problem could arise if you have a severe cardiovascular disease, like survived myocardial infarction, for instance, or untreated, uncontrolled, very high blood pressure. Then it's probably better to refrain from nicotine or at least to minimize its consumption. Another issue is pregnancy. There's a very long discussion about the effects of nicotine in pregnancy. The problem is that most of the data come from animal experiments, from rats and mice. And humans are not rats and mice. And even as a pharmacologist, I do a lot of animal experiments, but and argue with animal data. But in the case of nicotine, it's very difficult. The data from rodents are very hard to transfer to humans. So that's the same with the brain damage. Opponents claim that nicotine causes brain damage. So what about all the smokers who started in their teenage age with smoking? Do they all have damaged brains? I started smoking when I was 12 years old. Okay, I became a professor. You can say I would be even more smart if I hadn't smoked, but I don't feel that I have a damaged brain. This is just rubbish. Yeah? And then another claim is that nicotine is about a neurotoxin. I often read this, everybody repeats it. Oh, it's a neurotoxin, it's a deadly neurotoxin. This is simply not true. A neurotoxin would damage nerve cells, that would impair the function of nerve cells. And nicotine isn't doing this. On the contrary, nicotine mimics some effects of a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and thereby stimulates nerve cells. So it's a psychostimulant. Neurotoxicity can occur with nicotine, but only at extremely high doses that you never ever achieve by inhalation, neither by smoking nor by vaping. You have to drink a large amount at once, yeah? Or even better, if I may say better, by intravenous application. Of course, you can kill yourself with nicotine when you apply a high dose intravenously. Yeah? But this is not a regular use of nicotine. You can kill yourself by IV administration of air. 50 milliliters of air is going to kill you intravenously. Yeah? So, taken together, currently available data clearly show, and I did a lot of research on that. Yeah? They clearly show that the famous statement of Professor Michael Russell, South African pioneer of smoking cessation, which dates back to 1976, he published this in the British Medical Journal at that time, and that this statement is still valid. Russell said, people smoke for nicotine, but they die from the tar.
Thank you, Professor, for such an interesting and elaborate explanation. And I think while we're talking about nicotine, there is another misconception that has to do with addiction, and we probably should cover this topic more in depth too. It's interesting that vaping has been accused of being a gateway to smoking for adults and adolescents, but fewer than 1% of never smokers are current vapers, according to the data from the UK. So, and when it comes to adolescents, there are numerous studies and case studies too, but the recent one led by UCL researchers published in a journal of addiction found no statistically significant association between the prevalence of e-cigarette use and ever having smoked regularly. This is used as an indicator of uptake among those who are aged from 16 to 24. But the opposing argument commonly made is that nicotine is addictive and highly potent neurotoxin, as you've already mentioned, Professor. And on this basis, it is claimed that vaping can contribute to nicotine addiction. Now, the question is if nicotine addiction can be the sole reason why so many people struggle to give up smoking, actually. And if nicotine is not a problem in other conventional nicotine replacement therapy like gums or patches and others, how can it be a problem in vaping? So, Professor, what is the truth while we're addressing addiction? I know it's a big and very complex
Yeah.
issue, but could you tell our listener what is the truth behind nicotine addiction that everyone who wants to give up smoking through vaping should know about?
Well, it's indeed, as you said, it's a very complex topic and it's an extremely complex issue. And even experts in the field, I'm not an expert in addiction, but even the addiction experts, they don't even agree on the definition of addiction, dependence versus habit. You know, I followed these discussions, amusing, just because I don't contribute to this, but I see that even the experts do not agree about the definition of the terms. And it's very difficult to do science on a topic where you don't know what about you are talking actually. Yeah? You don't know even the definition. So definitions are typically the basis of every scientific theme. Well, I will try to comment on this, but first of all, I may emphasize that smokers don't die from their addiction but from inhalation of highly toxic compounds contained in tobacco smoke. So the argument, an often heard argument, is that switching from smoking to vaping means exchanging one addiction by another. This may indeed be the case. This may be true, yeah? But it's not the problem because you don't smoke from your addiction. We are all addicted or dependent on a variety of things. But the key point is this addiction associated with harm or not? Yeah? And e-cigarettes, even if you are addicted to e-cigarettes, the harm is 95, 99 or whatever percent less than the harm of smoking. So this is one point that I wanted to make clear to avoid misunderstandings. I don't understand this never-ending debate about the addiction, because the addiction is the least problem that we are encountering.
Mhm.
Well, but there are several compounds. Nicotine is just one component of of one factor that determines cigarette dependence. I want to talk about cigarette dependence or cigarette addiction, because the cigarettes are the most addictive tobacco products, as far as I know. Yeah? So the first component of cigarette dependence is what experts call a substance use disorder. So it's a substance dependent component of addiction. That's nicotine. Nicotine certainly causes or contributes to addiction through release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. Dopamine release is a typical effect of addictive drugs, and nicotine does it too. So we may conclude that nicotine contributes. It contributes. It's not fully accounts, but it contributes to cigarette dependence. Several studies indicate that the addictive potential of nicotine is relatively poor. It's both human, mostly animal, but also human studies. There are some human studies out showing that nicotine naive individuals, persons who were treated with nicotine, never smokers treated with nicotine for up to 6 months, didn't develop any kind of dependence or addiction. So this is strong evidence that nicotine is not a highly addictive drug, as is often claimed. And as you said, nicotine gums, there are some individuals dependent on nicotine gums. That may happen. They could continue to use gums for years. Some people continue to use it for years. But in most cases, most data indicate that nicotine is not highly addictive. So, and animal studies indicate that there's a that the cause, the substance dependent addiction or this cigarette addiction is caused by a combination of nicotine with other compounds present in tobacco smoke. One group of compounds that has been studied pretty extensively is inhibitors of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. This enzyme oxidizes and thereby inactivates dopamine. So the substance-dependent addiction of smokers could be caused by synergistic effect of nicotine, which releases dopamine, in combination with inhibitors of dopamine oxidation. So they together would result in an overall increase in brain dopamine levels. And this view is, as I said, supported by a number of animal experiments, and even human studies showed that smokers contain clearly, or the monoamine oxidase activity of smokers in certain tissues is significantly reduced as compared to controls. So they do have indeed reduced levels of monoamine oxidase, plus they increase their dopamine levels and they inhibit the dopamine breakdown. So this is the substance-dependent component, combination of nicotine with other ingredients of tobacco smoke. But substance dependence doesn't fully account for the addiction to cigarettes. Yeah? So there's plenty of evidence, of course, and we all know that conditioning to the smoking behavior plays a crucial role. All smokers know that the hand to mouth movement, the playing around with the cigarette, the feeling of inhaling something or exhaling a cloud, that these all are key factors of their dependence. Or maybe you wish to call it a habit. It's the definitions are difficult. One of my students, resisting my advice to switch from smoking to e-cigarettes, argued that she would miss the process of removing the ash from a burning cigarette in the ashtray. So she's accustomed to this removal. She likes the removal of the ash from the burning cigarettes. Others told me that they would miss the tactile feeling of cigarette filters. That's one reason why some individuals prefer the IQOS or other heat not burn products because they have real filters. So the tactile feeling of the filters between the lips could be important to some individuals. So smokers may get conditioned to a wide variety of individually different habits that make it very hard for them to stop. And here comes in the strength of e-cigarettes. Besides the filters or you cannot remove ash from the e-cigarettes and you don't have the filter, but they have a lot of strength, yeah, because they not only provide the nicotine like patches and gums do, but they allow smokers to maintain their accustomed ritual, widely maintain their accustomed ritual. And ironically, maintenance of the smoking behavior is one of the central arguments of public health against e-cigarettes. But it's also the key to the success of these products in smoking cessation. At a meeting with opponents, a public meeting with opponents, I once said that maintenance of the behavior is not a bug, as they claimed, but a feature of e-cigarettes. Well, so far to addiction. I mean, the question is whether vapers remain addicted or not. I think the data indicate that the addictive potential of e-cigarettes is lower than that of tobacco cigarettes. So over time, vapers reduce their dependence. They are not as dependent as they used to be before, but this is individually different. So everybody is different, and some stay highly addicted, some less. Some told me that they don't need their e-cigarettes anymore. They just do it for taste and for fun. So it's hard to generalize this.
Thank you very much, Professor, especially for elaborating on such a complex issue as addiction is. And I'm sure for making a lot of things much clearer for us, the listeners. Before I move on to the next question, I would like to remind our listeners that they have an opportunity to ask a question themselves too. You can either comment on our Twitter threads or request to speak by pressing the button. We will make sure to monitor your questions carefully, so do not hesitate to be active. Professor Meyer and our listeners, we are slowly moving to our final part of the interview, and we obviously cannot end it without mentioning flavors, especially now as flavors are being attacked by policymakers and will potentially face more restrictions worldwide. One of the main arguments made on the opposing side and the main reason for these bans is that flavors are supposedly a gateway for non-smokers to start vaping and eventually become smokers. We have a very interesting case of San Francisco that I wanted to bring up, where according to a new study from Yale School of Public Health, the flavor ban may have led to the opposite effect, actually. Analysis found that after the ban's implementation, high school students' odds of smoking conventional cigarettes doubled in San Francisco, comparing relative to the trends in districts without the ban. When it comes to adults, policymakers also often forget what a crucial role flavors play for the smoking cessation. And we at WVA believe that flavors are a powerful tool to help adult smokers quit. In your publication, Professor, you have also mentioned that sometimes the argument is made that flavorings could be harmful if inhaled, the opposing side. So that brings me to my next question. What is your response to these two main allegations, which are commonly used against flavors? So one would be the gateway part, where it's claimed that it's a gateway to smoking, and the next one would be flavorings could be harmful if inhaled. And what do you think are the real effects that flavors have on smoking cessation?
Let me start with a lot of questions now, and let me start with the harm. As you mentioned, my paper, I think you probably refer to the plus one paper that we published on the flavors. Well, when you publish a paper on e-cigarettes, you have to write down that they could be potentially harmful. Otherwise, you don't get it published. That's very easy. So, my personal opinion is that whatever flavors are in cigarettes and in liquids of e-cigarettes, and I include the famous diacetyl, which is already banned in most countries, and also the famous cinnamonaldehyde. Yeah, these are the most commonly or the most common flavors which are claimed to be toxic. Even with this, vaping is still an order of magnitude less harmful than smoking. So whatever is in your liquid, you're on the safe side with e-cigarettes as compared to smoking. Yeah. So the harm, the evidence for harm comes from cell culture studies. Yeah. So the researchers culture certain cells, lung epithelial cells or whatever, yeah, and then they put on either the vapor or the liquid. They incubate the cells with this, and then they look for biochemical changes within the cell. Yeah, we also do this kind of experiments all the time. They are easy, they are cheap, yeah, and you have something to publish. But I would never ever claim that the observations that I made with my cultured cells can be transferred to my grandmother, to my vaping grandmother. There's a it's far away from relevance. In our paper that you mentioned, we observed positive effects of most of the flavors on the vascular system. Yeah? So they relaxed blood vessels. That means they would reduce blood pressure theoretically. Of course, I didn't claim that our data indicate that the flavors reduce blood pressure. Why not? Because it's irrelevant. The concentrations that we used are much too high. You will never ever achieve this in the plasma. So I wouldn't claim that. But opponents of vaping, they like to do this kind of experiments and then come to far-reaching conclusions about in vivo effects. Yeah? So, but I don't think that not even hardcore opponents of e-cigarettes do really claim that flavors, except these some some compounds like cinnamon aldehyde diacetyl, are really toxic. They don't claim that mango flavor is toxic.
Right.
What they actually claim is that banning flavors would prevent, as you said, would prevent minors from vaping, because minors like mango and candy, while adults, the tough smokers, the Marlboro mens, yeah, they are happy with tobacco flavors. They just want tobacco because this tastes fine and so on. So most I don't want to say most, but many former smokers, when they switch to vaping, they start with tobacco because they think, oh, I cannot imagine that I vape banana or strawberry, and they start with some kind of Marlboro flavor. Yeah? But sooner or later, most of them realize that it's a matter of taste, and that the fruit flavors and candy flavors are just much more tasty than the tobacco flavors. But these policymakers, they are just ignorant, and they demonstrate unbelievable ignorance if they claim that just kids want flavors. Think about ice cream. I mean, I like strawberry ice cream like my kids like strawberry ice cream. And if you ban flavors in ice cream, what would we all do? We would either refrain from eating ice cream, or we would try to find some illegal sources for flavored ice cream, or, and it's the final solution, we would make our own ice cream at home. And that's what many vapers will do, at least the vapers who inform themselves. They will start to make their own liquids. That's like in Germany, they are debating about the ban of menthol in liquids. So menthol is a very popular flavor present in many liquids, even not only in menthol liquids, but also in many others where it's present in very small amounts. So the users don't even know that they vape menthol, but they like the taste. Yeah? So does a ban of menthol make any sense? You can buy menthol, 100-gram menthol, I think, for 10 euros at Amazon. And then you make your menthol solution, and then you start to make your own liquids. With the problem that some people who are how shall I say, who are less competent, let it put that way. People who are less competent start to mix their own liquids. They start doing with this do-it-yourself thing, and they may be using some food flavors that are not suitable for inhalation. And then we have the same problem that we had with the EVALI disaster in the United States in 1990.
Right.
in 2019, sorry, in 22 years ago, yeah, where we had this disaster, where we had let's say, an ingredient in the liquid which is not suitable for inhalation. And that caused all the disaster. Yeah? And so we could encounter the same when all people start to mix their own liquids. So it's better to refrain from flavor bans, of course. This is the most stupid idea I've ever heard. And why do they claim that? Maybe they are either really ignorant or they use an objectively wrong claim, yeah, as pretended argument to further reduce the appeal of vaping. That's my suspicion. They want to reduce the appeal of vaping. They want to prevent that all smokers switch to e-cigarettes, because this would be a financial disaster for many interest groups. I don't call them by name, but everybody knows who's meant.
Right, but for the public health overall, the consequences of the flavor bans still would be dreadful and negative. Thank you so much for elaborating on that and for talking about flavors so interestingly. Professor Meyer, it was an absolute pleasure. I think we have covered most of the topics that we wanted to talk about. And for me, it was a very interesting conversation to debunk the common myths about vaping. And thank you so much for all of this. And thank you for being here with us today.
Liza, it was a pleasure for me. I hope you are satisfied. I mean, I could talk for hours about this topic. I even wrote a book about e-cigarettes. And it's a never-ending story. And when I cover this topic in my lectures for students, it's hard for me to not do it over the whole semester, but to limit myself to an hour or so. Yeah, because I could talk a lot about it. Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of your podcast activity.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure, and we should do that more often. I will remind our listeners that our guest today was Professor of Pharmacology at the University of Graz and Scientific Advisor of the World Vapers Alliance, Professor Bernd. And please follow the professor on Twitter to find more useful information about harm reduction and vaping in particular. Professor, your work is priceless, and thank you very much again for this session and for everything else that you do, because plenty of works can be found online as well.
Thank you, Liza. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for your audience.
Thank you. To our listeners, I just want to thank you for being here with us today. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. Let's keep on combating the misinformation on vaping together. We will be back in 2 weeks to discuss more on vaping and policies around vaping globally. Have a great day or night, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Liza, and this was the podcast called Vapers Voice, hosted by the World Vapers Alliance. And please stay tuned for the next episode.